very much, Eleanor. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benedict Dellot. I am Head of AI Monitoring at the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. It's my pleasure to be chairing today's CogX panel debate on facial recognition technology. We have a great panel to help us make sense of this very topical and much talked about innovation. We have Stephanie Hare, an independent researcher and broadcaster and author of a book on AI and ethics. We have Pete Fussey, Professor of Sociology at the University of Essex and the author of a research report on the Met Police's trial of FRT systems. And we have Jonathan Turley, Shapiro Professor of Public Interest Law at George Washington University and a criminal defense attorney and also a legal analyst. And we'll also be hearing from my colleague, Dr. Dudhwala, who is the lead author on a very recent CDEI paper looking at the implications of FRT in the UK. Now, before we hear from those speakers, I think it's probably worth just giving some context as to why we're having this session, if it isn't obvious already, and why we think it's important. So facial recognition, as everyone who is dialing in and viewing this live stream knows, is one of the most divisive innovations to have emerged in recent years. On the one hand, you have proponents who talk about its benefits for efficiency and security across a range of different services, from the very prosaic, like when you open up a phone and you don't need to tap in a PIN because you can use FRT to access that, to the much more serious and sophisticated, such as identifying missing persons or identifying suspected criminals in a crowd. On the other hand, you have critics who talk about FRT as an apparatus of surveillance, and you have civil society groups who claim it can interfere with people's privacy, for example, with facial data being collected about people's knowledge or active consent. FRT is not a wholly new technology. Over the past year, we've seen and heard plenty of views and claims and arguments about what it means for society, the good and the bad. And I'm sure every person at CogX will have a view, and often a view that's quite stridently held, about what to do about it. So what's the point of this debate? Why are we going over this again when we go over the same old ground? Well, we think it's worth commenting on and having another debate and a continued debate on FRT for several reasons. Reason number one is that it's high stakes. So this is a very powerful technology that allows people to know who someone is and their whereabouts. And that's a capability that no human has ever had before. And we're on the verge of making it available to a lot of individuals and organizations. So it's really important that we keep talking about whether it's sufficiently well governed. And the second reason is that we've actually learned quite a lot about the technology over the last year. And it's probably now time to pause, to reflect, to take stock of what we've learned. We've got new research, we've seen new use cases and deployments, we've had court hearings, we've had early attempts to strengthen the governance around this technology. For example, we've seen what's happened in the States, in San Francisco and elsewhere, where you've seen bans and moratoriums on the use of this technology. So there's plenty of reason to have this conversation, and there's plenty to talk about as well. So without further delay, it'd be good to get started. Before we hear from our speakers, I'd like to invite my colleague, Dudhwala, to give a short overview of the Centre's recent paper on facial recognition, which will be a useful stimulus to the debate.
Thanks, Benedict. It's great to be a part of this and be virtually amongst such a great cast of panelists. At CDEI, our goal is to create the conditions in which ethical innovation can thrive, an environment in which people are confident that their values are reflected in the way that data-driven technology is developed and deployed, where we can trust the decisions informed by algorithms are fair, and where risks posed by innovation are identified and addressed. Now, I think there are a few innovations that have divided opinion on those points more than facial recognition technology. And as Benedict alluded to, some can claim that it will make our streets safer, our bank accounts more secure, and public services more accessible. Yet others will argue that it will violate our right to privacy amongst a whole suite of other rights, and therefore must be banned immediately. And all the time, whilst this debate is going on, police forces continue to trial and deploy this technology, and industry continues to increase the scope of its use in retail and public spaces. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes laying the groundwork for this conversation that is to come, to help those that are dazed and confused by briefly highlighting what we mean when we talk about facial recognition technology, where it's being used today, and some of those benefits and risks that we mentioned earlier. Now, at its core, facial recognition technology refers to algorithmic systems that can analyze a person's face to make claim of an identity. Now, that's very crude and very basic, and of course, it's not as simple as that. And there are a number of different types of FRT and a number of different contexts for its use. For me, it's easy to break them down into three different distinctions. The first is when facial recognition is used to verify someone's identity, i.e. to unlock a phone or a laptop, or to identify individuals, so scanning a group of faces in a crowd to see if anybody is on a watch list. Secondly, it can be used retrospectively, so analysing previously collected faces, or it can be live, processing facial data in the real everyday setting in real time. And finally, it can either be fully automated, so a match being sufficient to lead to action, i.e. your laptop unlocking, or it can be used to assist decision-making. So a human operator might be invited to decide whether or not to follow up on a match that indicates that a person is of interest. Now, the extent to which an FRT system is helpful or detrimental to society will depend on the context, as well as the accuracy and biases of the specific algorithms deployed, and each has to be assessed according to their own merits and risks. So what are some of these merits and risks? The benefits can broadly and quite crudely be put into three different types. And these are often touted when thinking about why we should use FRT systems. So on the one hand, we have security, and people will argue that it does strengthen access security in a number of different settings. Secondly, efficiency. Given the right conditions, FRT can instantaneously verify someone's identity and speed up, for example, queues at border control. And finally, scale. New forms of security infrastructure are made instantly possible by being able to scan at one time simultaneously a bunch of faces in a crowd, which otherwise couldn't have been done by a human operator alone. But of course, there are many, many risks, and these risks are talked about far more often than those benefits are, and with good reason. On the one hand, there is a huge potential for facial recognition technology to undermine individual privacy. It's very, very difficult to gain explicit consent when facial recognition technology is used live in public spaces. And often, even with the best intentions, it's difficult for people sometimes to even know it's happening if they miss the signs or they just pass through them without looking. And it reduces our ability to be anonymous and move about our space in society without being known to a facial processing system. Secondly, there is this huge potential to entrench bias and unequally distributed consequences, especially when systems have different accuracy rates for different demographic groups. And it's been shown that people who are Black or Asian or women are much more wrongly identified by these facial recognition systems than other groups in society. And finally, there is this opportunity, or I shouldn't say opportunity really, but the ability of facial recognition technologies to bestow public and private organizations with disproportionate power to surveil the population. And this can lead to potentially worrying consequences for rights such as freedom for expression and association, and especially pertinent to today, can make people think twice about going out to protest or to speak up about things that they feel are not right. And that's sometimes known as having a chilling effect on democracy. Now, at least one reasonable conclusion that we can draw from all of this is that FRT does present greater hazards when it's used to identify people rather than to verify them, and particularly when used in live deployments and in public settings. And this most often happens because police have, at least 3 forces have used them and trialed them and deployed them in the UK to date. I won't dwell too much on that, and I'm sure some our panelists will have a lot more to say about that, so I won't steal their limelight. But it's important to reiterate that the degree of risk that FRT poses to society will depend on the type of system being used and the manner of its deployment, and I'm sure that will be most of the discussion that's covered in today's talk. So back to you, Benedict.
Thank you very much, Fuzz. That was a really useful scene setter, and it gives everyone, including the audience, some background on the what, the where, the how of FRT, and of course the distinction between different types of FRT as well, between those that identify, those that verify, and the different settings they're used in. It's not a homogeneous technology; it's used in the same way everywhere. Now, I'd like to invite each of our panelists just to say a few opening remarks about their perspectives on this technology, and And really, the kind of exam question for this is, can we picture a world in which facial recognition technology is used in the best interest of society, and how do we get there? And that's the kind of thing we'll be talking about for the rest of this session. I wondered whether, Pete, you'd like to go first and give us your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Benedict, and yeah, thanks for the invitation to speak. It's nice to be on the panel, but also to continue to support your work. I thought your report was good, actually. I think it made a good job of navigating or making sense quite a complicated landscape. Speaking as someone, I've researched facial recognition for more than 10 years, and it gets more complicated the more you get into the details of it. So in response to that, really, there's a couple of things I wanted to say. Just a couple of quick opening remarks, and then a few substantive points that I hope will be sort of fleshed out in the discussion. So by way of context, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Fussey's point about it's important to differentiate the different uses of facial recognition. When we talk about facial recognition, we're talking about a similar algorithmic process, but we're talking about vastly different applications. A lot of the time, there's a difference between the opening up your iPhone, for instance, using facial recognition algorithms, recognizing you despite lockdown Hare or whatever it is, and deploying cameras for something like the Notting Hill Carnival, for instance. So the use and application is really important, but the technological differences are important too. So one-to-one verification, such as going through an airport gate or unlocking an iPhone, doesn't require a big database in order to function, whereas other forms, such as live facial recognition, do. And then the second introductory point I think that's really important to make is that facial recognition is fundamentally different from many other forms of surveillance. It might look the same as things like CCTV, but it's fundamentally different, and I would add it's fundamentally more intrusive as well. Okay, so in terms of the research I've done as well, I led the independent review of the Met Police trial, spent a lot of time in surveillance vans looking at how the cameras work, how humans engage with them, and so on. And I think there are probably 5 points that I would raise. First of all, which speaks to the heart of your exam question, Benedict, about authorization and regulation. Often when we talk about the uses of facial recognition, we talk about the legitimate aim. So police using surveillance technology to keep the public safe is a legitimate aim. And I think that debate has been won to some extent. So then the discussion needs to go into other areas, such as what is the legal basis for its use? Is the use of facial recognition necessary in a democratic society, and other elements of the human rights test? At the moment, there is no legislation that explicitly, the word explicit is important here, that explicitly authorises police use of facial recognition, not in the UK, not in Europe. And there is no dedicated oversight body. There is a huge regulatory gap. And this is something not just critical voices like mine have said, all of the regulators have highlighted this as well. Issues of necessity are really important. Often in the work that I did, you would see a defined use of facial recognition, say for wanted people, and that category or definition of wanted would be expanded, and often expanded to include missing people, which is something completely different altogether and has all sorts of implications for proportionality and all sorts of things. The second substantive point I want to raise is about which rights are at stake, and I think Fuzz has already said most of this, so I won't sort of restate what she says, but I think the rights to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association are fundamental, which it's really important when we're talking about the ethics and rights of facial recognition to extend the debate beyond privacy. And this raises questions over whether data protection is an adequate framework in which to regulate facial recognition, which I don't believe it is. And then there's a whole question about protection from discrimination in Europe, Article 14 rights, for instance, which are particularly prescient at the moment. Third point I want to mention is about performance. There are many different ways in which evaluation statistics are used. We live in a time where science is leveraged for political expediency, and there's many questions over the metrics and the ways in which we evaluate performance, which I can go into in tedious detail if people require. And also, when we talk about performance of facial recognition, it's not just about raw system performance, it's also about the human interaction with the system. So how do humans adjudicate computer-suggested facial recognition matches, and so on. In the work that I've done, we've seen a demonstrable tendency for human deference to facial recognition algorithms, for instance. And then finally, we also need to talk about watch lists, the database that underpins facial recognition technologies and systems, who is enrolled on databases, why, where the information is drawn from, what oversight exists on these sort of data-driven sort of elements of the process as well. But those are just some opening thoughts from me.
Paper as well, in terms of the different issues you raise, and I think what you've done very neatly there is talk not just about the algorithms and how they're trained and their accuracy, but also then how they're deployed and used. And I think this question of how watch lists are built and developed is a really important one. And we'll get onto that, I'm sure, in the discussion. I think, Jonathan, could you follow on from that? And I'm sure you have a lot to say, especially on the legal and regulatory side, based on your experience in the States.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for including me on this interesting panel. There's a great deal to talk about, and there's a great deal to worry about. From those of us associated with the privacy community, FRT is perhaps the greatest threat to privacy that we have seen in generations. Part of that threat is magnified by the fact that our existing laws are not well suited for dealing with a technology like FRT. The law, and I'm including the common law, has always been a race between technology and privacy, and at least the United States Supreme Court has done a perfectly horrible job historically in dealing with that. A lot of privacy protections emerged only after technology made a mockery of a series of different tests designed to protect privacy. FRT is a real game changer. First of all, it's a reality. There's a huge market for FRT. Consumers want it. Every iPhone user can explain why. I tend to be a dinosaur when it comes to both the use and implications of technology. I'm not crazy about change, particularly if I don't know how it's going to affect privacy. But the fact is, this is here in a very big way. Billions of dollars have been spent. It's no accident that countries like China and Russia are leaders in FRT, and they are the ones that are really putting a great deal of money in using FRT. The Chinese have already used it in protest situations. The Russians have incorporated it into their public surveillance system. So it's not any mystery why a lot of countries are enthralled with FRT. So there are a couple of different concerns that have to be grappled with. The most immediate is that we have seen a racial and gender bias type of error in FRT that is persistent. The companies have tackled some of this. So the early tests showed very disturbing error rates, particularly for people of color, and also for particularly women of color. Some of that was algorithmic and was able to be addressed. Some of it was training. But there still is a problem, a serious problem, and it's hard to imagine implementing FRT without dealing with that problem. And so that is a big issue in the United States and in Europe, and also in the private sector. My research is primarily focused on the threat of FRT to democratic values. For me, the emerging technology really does threaten the ability of people to gather, to for the right of assembly, the right of free speech, if they believe that they can be identified readily, and they can. So the problem is that people are going to be very careful of who they associate with, where they go, what they're listening to. If there's a data bank, even if it's not immediately given to the police, but they're in it. Also, this identification system has been privatized. So there are products where you can be searched for any of your images on the internet and social media. And one Russian product is particularly invasive, where it seemed to be able to get through sort of security walls to find every one of your pictures that come up on social media. That has an enormous chilling effect on our most fundamental rights, and it has an impact on democracy. So I have a study that's coming out of Boston University looking at how we can address this as an initial matter. And what it suggests is that we may have passed the Rubicon in terms of protecting anonymity. We may no longer be able to count on being anonymous because of this technology, and we may have to shift to obscurity, trying to find systems by which we can obscure the identification of people with both public and private means. That includes criminalizing some aspects of the use of FRT, banning some products, but more importantly, making sure that we can obscure images so that people feel that they can go out in public, can associate with perhaps unpopular groups. And so that's the focus of my work. Frankly, I've always been optimistic that we can solve problems, but I'm really quite nervous about the impact of FRT on democratic process. I do not see how a fishbowl society where you are instantly identified, where you are in data banks, is not going to impact how people speak, how they associate, how they organize. And I think that's exactly why we see these countries are very interested in it. I think they are as interested in the chilling effect on conduct and speech than they are on the actual use of these images. It is a fact that if you know that you are under surveillance, you change in who you speak to and how you speak. And that's the primary concern that I have.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was really beautiful. And I think you sort of bring out a couple of things there which are really important. One is the issues which are born out of the technology underperforming, so problems around bias in particular. And the second is what happens when the technology actually performs really well, and what happens when people fear that performance and that affecting their ability to move freely in society. So I just want to finish up now and ask Stephanie to come forward with her own perspectives on this technology.
Hello. Thanks so much to our two earlier speakers. It was really interesting. I was taking notes and tweeting some of that out. I think a lot of people are pretty aware of the issues around facial recognition technology not being particularly accurate. And we've discussed some of that, and that really matters in a Black Lives Matters context. We have seen some very questionable policing practices over in my home country of the United States in the past week. And of course, there's really nothing new for any American. Everything that we've seen is really just a repeat of real national trauma. And I think it's very difficult for the victims of that type of policing, and it must be very challenging for good police officers who are trying to do their best and want to keep everybody safe. And one of the points that was raised in this discussion was that surveillance technology has kind of demonstrated its value in terms of security. And I think I would actually question that. There's a really interesting principle in bioethics that comes from the Hippocratic Oath of first, do no harm. And I would really like to see researchers analyze forensically with data, and this is going to be qualitative data. It's going to be based on interviews from all sections of society, not just on quantitative data, as to whether or not we think that technologies like facial recognition are helping or hurting. Because if you don't trust the police, as we have seen quite recently, this undermines the very fabric of civil society. The police have to do a really difficult job. Here we are broadcasting from London, a lot of us, where we've had a shortage of police officers due to austerity for the past 10 years. And yet these officers have had to face really difficult challenges like a knife crime epidemic. They have to face policing in a counterterrorism situation in a city that has been hit repeatedly, and they have done a brilliant job at protecting us from so many other attacks. So we don't necessarily want to make this into how this technology is just allowing policing to do a bad job. We want to give the police the best tools that they can have for the job. And we want it to be embedded in law. And we want people to have confidence in the technology and confidence in the oversight and confidence in the law so that they can continue to have really excellent relations with the police. And if you lose that trust, I think we have a real problem on our hands in terms of the functioning of democracy. So before we go introducing this technology, and I called for it at CogX last year, and I repeat that call again, I would just like to see a moratorium on it being rolled out. By all means, if companies want to continue researching this so they can at least solve the accuracy problem, go for it. But we haven't solved the social problem. Not a single country in the world has solved that problem of what this does in terms of the chilling effect on democracy, which we've just heard of, how protests would change the very texture and fabric of a protest, how it changes when you're being surveyed. We've done nothing to address the private sector's use. And the police, again, come under quite a lot of criticism, but they at least have to announce when they're using it or trialing it. And they have to face academics and critics and questions from the public. The private sector gets none of this, yet the private sector is making so much money on it and rolling it out all across the United Kingdom with no regulatory framework, no real challenge, and no transparency. So Lord Clement Jones, that's Timothy Clement Jones in the House of Lords, put together a private members bill. I don't think it's going to be heard until 2021 because he drew a number that's got him a little bit lower down on the waiting list for that bill to be heard. But we have a chance in the United Kingdom, at least, to have a moratorium on this technology. Just pause, review, get expert testimony, ask the public. The Ada Lovelace Institute is doing brilliant work on trying to have citizens' juries so that citizens can come and express their concerns, ask their questions. We need to make this something that is really joined up and that leverages the fantastic scholarship that is happening around the world and making real reference to real world case studies of how this is being used, not just in China, where facial recognition is part of an entire surveillance package to keep over 1 million people locked in concentration camps in the West, purely because of their religious and ethnic affiliation, something that could be done anywhere in the world. But also in the United States, where companies like Microsoft have said they would not sell facial recognition to law enforcement because they feared human rights abuses. Amazon, which is making so much money, does this largely in part through its facial recognition platform. It also is selling Amazon Doorbell, the Ring doorbell technology, and working with police forces to give that technology to people. There's no framework about whether they can just requisition the footage or not. We need to answer all of these questions. This is not something where you test this live on the public with zero transparency and zero oversight. So I will wrap up on those remarks, but if anything, what's happened in the United States in the past week has only made me more concerned about the use of this technology. Around the world, it is being used in ways that deserve critique. The public needs to be informed. So I really wish Lord Clement Jones the best of luck in getting his members' bill forward. I hope that members of the House of Commons will take up the mantle and discuss it more in the representative body for this country's public. And I hope that we work together with researchers and representatives across the globe. If we want to use this technology, we have to make the case to use it safely. Otherwise, it's Hippocratic oath time. First, do no harm.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I think those are really important themes of trust, transparency, effective oversight. You also really touched on a very important point about private sector use of the technology, and often that's an overlooked aspect and use case. I just wanted to turn to one of the things that you mentioned in your remarks, which is around public opinion and involving the public within these debates on how the technology should be used. It sounds like most people on the panel have a particular view of this technology, which is that its use should be curtailed, as much as possible, at least in certain settings. But if you ask the public, and this is the public at large, it seems that from public polling that there's actually more of a relaxed attitude towards this technology. So Ada Lovelace Institute, I think they did a poll last year that found that around about a third of the public said they're uncomfortable with police forces using this technology. But then you've got 2/3 either don't know or say they're comfortable. So I'm just wondering how we've arrived at a situation where the public is at odds with many civil society groups and experts. Is it that the experts are wrong? Is it that the public are misinformed? Is it that the information just hasn't yet to seep out into the public debate? Does anyone want to take that point? Pete, I think you want to come in there, and then Stephanie.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things quickly to say on that. First of all, of course, public opinion is important, but it shouldn't be decisive in these debates. We don't have this very utilitarian sense that what generally the public wants, we should always do. Otherwise, we wouldn't have minority rights, for instance. So, indeed, the whole human rights framework is set up in order to protect people from arbitrary state interference, people who are on the margins of society, and so on. So just because there's a majority doesn't necessarily mean it should be done, or that it should just guide decision making. Secondly, I dispute the idea that the public is overwhelmingly in favour of facial recognition. Other sort of public polling suggests there's a small percentage of the public who's in favour, but it's raised a referendum thin. And also then if you start to go through different demographic groups, younger people are overwhelmingly opposed to it, and people who are more likely to say have interference from police, who are, say, from particular minorities, are also opposed to it. So I think we need to be extremely careful and limited when we start to recruit, the public as a legitimation for this technology.
Thanks, Pete. Stephanie, I think you want to come in next.
Yes. I think there's also a question of just being informed. So part of what would be amazing about having a debate, for instance, here in the United Kingdom that occurs within Parliament as a way of actually bringing in expert testimony and allowing elected representatives to interrogate those experts and bring in public opinion, is that we can all get on the same page. And I think right now, you've got some really fantastic research that's being done, but it's that classic question of how does it get out of the ivory tower and onto the streets, right? And in people's homes and discussed in every place that everybody's discussing it. So if you don't know how this data can be used, if you don't know how Clearview AI has taken your data without your consent, pissing off the companies that it took it from, namely the social media companies that we all use, you might not understand how the police are using it, how they might be using it in secret, right? If you don't understand the terms of the debate, you might be expressing an opinion on something that, given a bit more information, you would change your mind. But getting everybody on the same page is so hard. And that's why I think the best place to do that would actually be in the very house of democracy itself. Put it into your parliament, and then we can have that discussion.
Yeah, and an absolute important route to bring in minority group perspectives as well. And then Jonathan, you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said, but I'd like to add perhaps a pessimistic note. When I speak with privacy advocates in the United States, I often caution that we should not delude ourselves to believe that we can make this cat walk backwards. I mean, this technology is now incorporated in a variety of products that people like. There's a vanity aspect to this that is undeniable. There's a commercial in the United States of Jimmy who goes around and he's identified immediately at airports and businesses after spending his life having to explain who he is. It's a really insidious commercial because it appeals to that vanity that suddenly you are recognized. And people do like those technology products, and we're not going to see that restricted. So even if we restrict government use, which I think is something we need to really seriously consider, I don't think we should believe that we can limit this technology or this research. I also do the truly insidious aspect of this threat of privacy is the fact that it appeals to the consumer. And so the rapid expansion of this product is due to that consumer need. If we were to, for example, limit facial technology used on cell phones or in banking or other types of products, I think there would be a public backlash. And so in the privacy community, I think we have to deal with the reality that this thing is here. And we have to find a way to channel that public support for these products into a more productive area, to educate them, yes, but to work with that desire on their part while trying to show them and coax them into ways of protecting privacy, dealing with these very serious problems that were just identified, including, I think, the absolutely relevant and pressing example of what's happening in the United States and what would happen if this were used in a protest situation.
And can I just challenge that a little bit, Jonathan? Because I think obviously today we've seen IBM's announcement that they would stop creating and selling FRT systems. Would you not say that that was a reaction to some anti-FRT sentiment among consumers and the public at large?
I do, but I'm sorry if this doesn't go over well, but I don't think it's going to make a difference. There are 1,000 companies that are spending billions of dollars on FRT research. China and Russia alone are occupying this field. It will not stop these products, and it will not stop their spread. And I think we have to be realistic about that.
Does anyone want to come in on that? Does anyone agree, disagree vehemently at that point?
I'm happy to come in on that. I think if we look even just compared to 2 years ago or even last year, we saw Google's CEO Sundar Pichai calling for a moratorium on facial recognition just a few months ago. I know it's difficult with time due to COVID. It sort of compressed everything, but it wasn't actually just that long ago that even the Alphabet CEO was like, let's just pause. And to now have IBM make that decision for whatever reason, it almost doesn't matter whatever reason it was. Lots of tech companies drop unprofitable tech, but they don't write to the US Congress and make a political point about it. So I think that's maybe the substantive change about what IBM has done. But I think you're absolutely right to say loads of companies are making a ton of money on this. IBM is just one. Google is just one. Amazon is just one. There's all the tiny ones. There's Clearview AI that we just discussed. There's TrueFace. There's Digital Barriers. Those companies may feel that they are doing the right thing. It'd be great to hear them put their case to the public in front of Parliament, in front of researchers, in front of just people, ordinary people, so that we could discuss it and really shine that sunlight on it. And then we could have all of the other people testify as well to say why they're concerned. So we may not be able to stamp it out in authoritarian countries, but we've stopped a lot of companies building really crap tech and products or chemicals or doing medical things that are really questionable in terms of ethics or law. I think we might just be in for the long haul on this. So I'm with you in that I think the odds are tough. It's going to be a tough fight, but I'm optimistic that people want change and they want accountability and transparency and ethics in what they're doing, not just in technology, but in most areas of their life. I think that's the sort of 2020 moment that's happening. So in my humble opinion.
Pete, sure.
Yeah, just very briefly, I mean, and just to build on Jonathan's point, which I agree with. I mean, I think there was a survey by the Biometrics Institute, which is a trade organisation for biometric tech industries last year, and asking the question of which was the kind of area of biggest growth in the biometrics industry. And by a country mile, it was facial recognition. So what was the phrase used? Yes, it's difficult to see the cat walking backwards on it. It is here to stay. But I also think the IBM decision is so interesting on so many levels. I mean, who knows what the motivation is? It could be ethics washing, whatever it is. But I think something that's quite interesting about that announcement today is it's harder to therefore argue that regulating facial recognition is somehow anti-innovation. And this has been an argument that's been used a lot when people have sought to regulate the tech industry. But if, like as Stephanie says, Google Alphabet calling for regulation, if IBM pulling away, it's harder to make that argument. And I think it's an interesting moment on that basis alone.
So we haven't got long left, unfortunately, but I just want to make sure that we commenting on the sort of opportunities that this technology brings, as well as the risks that it poses. So if Jonathan's point about this technology is here to stay is right, how do we make sure that we ensure that it is used to improve society for beneficial purposes? And I'm sure we can think of different use cases. So I'm just wondering, what are the conditions that need to be in place for us to be happy that this technology is being used responsibly, if we have to set out those conditions, whether it's around the training or the watch lists, or around oversight mechanisms? Is there one thing that you would like to see put in place to ensure that this technology is used for the benefit of society? Jonathan?
I'd be happy to start. I actually have another study that I'm working on now that goes through proposals on how to limit FRT on the presupposition that it is in fact here to stay. It is going to be ubiquitous. It already is in technology, but we can do a great deal. And my research really focuses on what I think are the greatest threats, which may not even be Big Brother as much as Little Brother. We have a lot of products now that are being implemented that identify people within seconds of their entering the store, bring up any shoplifting records, and conveys that information to store security. That's an example of how private technology can create this type of fishbowl society, which is what privacy advocates fear the most. So we can have an assortment of tools to ban certain types of products, limit the use of data banks, including how long images can be stored, limit the use of whether data banks can share images. I suggest in one of my studies the use of what I call a digital watermark to try to deal with social media images that go to this Russian product that is able to instantly pick out every image you have on social media and link it to everyone you know. Those are the things where we need to get really aggressive on to get ahead of this technology. If that type of program gets out there in a big way, and I think it is in the process of doing it, we may have lost this fight. I mean, we could restrict the government's use of FRT, but if there are private products out there that turn us into a fishbowl, it's not going to matter because people are going to conform their conduct in the same way we're trying to avoid from government coercion or threat.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm afraid now we're going to have to wrap up this session. We do have a Q&A after this at 3 p.m. for those who can stick around. And for those who can't, you can look at our FRT research on the CDEI's website and the work of our panelists. Do find us on Twitter and elsewhere. And just to say thank you very much for CogX for having us.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.